listen up. I think we're going to go ahead and get started now. It's just after 8, so Keshav Mohan. You can refer to him as K to make it easier. And looking forward to hearing what he has to say today. He said he's going to do a little bit different style. He's going to go through his notes and go through a talk kind of on the quicker side, and then open it up for questions and just do a lot of conversation after that. So, some things that I've learned about Kay. He's a double dookie with the law school, not with the business school. Currently works for BizLab as an executive vice president, and I'm sure you'll go through more about what BizLab does in your speech, so I want to take that away. But then also he's done some interesting things. He's done a lot of cool traveling, done a lot of skydiving, and was one thing I found interesting, worked in prisons in South Africa for a while. And that's about all I've got. So please join me in welcoming Kay.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it. So I go by Kay. My mom calls me Kay, so please call me that. I was just telling the story when I was born. My parents got into a fight, so they spelled my name the North Indian way and they pronounced it the South Indian way, so it's wrong everywhere. And so the tenuous piece is they just call me Kay. So let me start here. When I was a law student at Duke Law, I had a growing frustration with a lot of the speakers that came to the law school. And the frustration was often they would come from what I call Mount Olympus, or someone really great, and they would talk to us, but we wouldn't get any actionable information out of it. Right? And that was my struggle, especially because I was kind of a different law student. I got into law school, frankly, by accident, fell backwards into it. Was really trying to find my way, was more of an entrepreneur who was getting a law degree. And I realized the reason for that was there was a misalignment of incentives between what Duke Law wanted and what I wanted. There's nothing wrong with it. You just had to recognize how the world was. And the misalignment was that often for Duke, and frankly conferences I go to or companies, there's more of a priority on getting the person of the right stature than there is getting someone who kind of gives actionable information to the audience, right? And my words for it were TBU, which is a phrase that came up with. It means true but useless, right? So often I would have someone come in and be really great. I'll give you an example. You know, if you have a Supreme Court justice come, you really don't care what he or she says. It's more important to say that Justice Scalia or Ginsburg was here than it was that they provide actionable information. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's part of what a university does, is facilitate access to people who've got an amazing history and experience. It was just a recognition of that misalignment with what they had to offer and what I needed. And I often found that people of higher and higher stature, frankly, because they're super busy, don't have as much time to tailor their talks to the audience at hand, right? So my job today, my goal today, is to try and be the opposite of TBU for you, is to provide you actionable information. So here are my requests. Let me get through the totality of what I have here. I've got about 2 pages. I'm going to run through it as fast as I can. And then I will answer any questions you have on anything on which I can speak intelligently. But please accept my answer if I say I don't know as truth, and I just don't know the answer. So I'd rather tell you I don't know something than try and make up something that's totally false, and which you will verify as false by going on Google about 5 seconds after this talk, right? So what I want to talk to you about today is how to build a great culture. My history is a little varied. I've had a life of a series of historical accidents, kind of came from the nonprofit world, worked in prisons in South Africa and orphans in Bolivia and for the government at various levels when I was a student and a little bit when I was out. I worked for the Dubai government as a fellow down in Caracas, Venezuela, and then went through law school, worked at a major corporate law firm. It was about a $750 million institution, and was giving talks around the country, interacted with a lot of startups and entrepreneurs. Actually, out of law school, I joined a startup here in Durham called Zen Technologies. Zen Sound Innovations was the long name, which had just received a round of $10.7 million by Intersouth Capital. And so Kit Fry, who I'm sure a lot of you all know, basically called me up and said, hey, you know, I'm leaving Intersouth. I'm going to become the CEO of this company. What would you say if I come into your house? And I don't know what you're going to do, but I'll give you a chair, a desk, internet connection, and a phone, and you know, there's going to be a ton of work, so we'll figure it out. And so here I am out of law school with my master's degree, and I'm plugging in computers under desks and ordering, our equipment and paper and stuff like that, because that's what was needed if you ever joined a startup. And so no job's too small, but Kip's great. He's the kind of guy who has a 50,000-foot view and says, this is what I need done, and puts a lot of trust in his team. And so, I was doing all that stuff, but I was also kind of building technology documents for the company and running hiring, all kinds of stuff that I had no idea what I was doing, but you either swim or you drown. And so I chose to swim and went from there. And now I'm at BizLab, which is known as an operating company just outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So we operate multiple businesses. We had a software company which we just sold. We have an advisory investment bank with about $75 million in assets. We have an internet marketing company called RocketClicks, which does pay-per-click marketing, SEO, and what's called conversion rate optimization for clients. And we've got the largest online reseller for Dish Network, which is called Sterling Satellite. So to give you our model in a very simple form, we advertise online and then we close sales via call center. So we're approximately 200 employees across all our entities in about 70,000 square feet in a town called Menominee Falls, as I mentioned, outside of Milwaukee. So let me run through how to build a great culture from my varied experience in all these organizations. And so what I've tried to do historically is pick up the good, leave the bad, and try to build and improve as I go. To me, I think a great culture has three characteristics. Okay, it's respectful, it's resilient, and it's resourceful. Respectful, resilient, resourceful. Those are the three things that I look for in any great culture. So how do you build this great culture? It has various components. I think the first and most important component for you as leaders is very simple. You need to keep your word. You need to keep your promises, okay? You would be surprised at how many people sort of make promises but do not keep them. You need to know that a promise is an expectation of a result. And more specifically, promises create reliance, okay? So if you say you're going to do something, people are going to expect you to do it, and they're going to plan their actions around you doing it. There are no small promises, there are no big promises, there are no explicit promises, there are no implicit promises, there are only promises. And you should test yourself on how you keep your promises both in your social and your professional life, okay? So this is my challenge to all of you, is to take a couple days and just track all the promises you make on a day-to-day basis and see which ones you do not keep, okay? You say you're going to be on time, but you're not. You're using poor time management, you schedule meetings together, okay? You say you're going to do something, but you don't. I think the biggest thing to create a healthy culture is the team wants to look up their leaders and really believe that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. I think kept promises build trust. Okay, so if I know I can rely upon you, I'm going to believe in you and I'm going to follow you more. And you need to know that ultimately you and your organization will live or die by reputational capital. It's that simple. I think the second component to having a great culture is you need to have a cohesive purpose, okay? A cohesive purpose is something that's clear, inspirational, and can act as a tiebreaker. People like fairness. And by that I mean culture is the tiebreaker, okay? So look at various companies out there that have a very clear cultural statement. Southwest is the low-cost airline, right? I just got back from meeting with the exec team for Habitat for Humanity International. And so you talk to them, and they all say that their goal is to end poverty housing for everyone on Earth. That's their cultural tiebreaker, right? For us at BizLab, and primarily for Sterling Satellite, our cultural statement is we want to create great leaders that convert online interests into economic value. And so whenever we have a question or an argument or a discussion, that's the test, that's the tiebreaker, right? And Southwest is probably the best at this in terms of the example of any business decision. They ask, will this make us the low-cost airline, right? So having a cohesive purpose, again, clear, inspirational, and can act as a tiebreaker is going to enable you to have a stronger culture going forward. The third thing, and this is super important, you need to hire resourceful people. Systems are created by components and teams are created by individuals. When I hire someone, ultimately, when they talk about A players, the thing I'm looking for is, are you resourceful? Can you find a way, right? All organizations suffer from limitations of resources, time, energy, money. And in truth, if I'm hiring someone for a position, what I need from them is to solve a problem for me, solve a pain point. And I'm looking for them to come in and just find a way to get it done. I think, we often talk about intelligence, right? And when you're in law school, there's always this question of, who's the smartest, who's the most knowledgeable. I gauge intelligence by a different way. I think I look at someone's ability to learn. That's it. So to me, intelligence is a measure of your ability to learn, because I think if you have a high ability to learn, you will be able to be resourceful in a tough scenario. Fourth component to building great culture is you need to build leadership redundancy. Okay? So all organizations and cultures are only as strong as their weakest link. I think when you look at kind of leadership positions in your company, you should have a primary and secondary for all positions of leadership. You would be surprised at how many organizations rely upon what I call the charismatic leader at some level of their company. And when that leader goes down, they're in trouble. Okay? So whether you're a student club or a Fortune 500 CEO, in your key positions of leadership, you have someone who can step in if that primary person goes down. 5, I think it's important to discern and mitigate dependencies. Okay? So this is sort of the same concept of going beyond leadership redundancy to any aspect of your organization. For example, if you have a high dependence on one customer who provides the majority of your revenue, you need to figure out a way to mitigate that dependency, right? So you don't want to be highly dependent upon one individual. So just ask yourself questions, right? What are the weakest portions of your organization? What can you do to mitigate that problem now? It's often just having a skills bench with substitutes, right? I mean, right now, I'm sure you all know if you've been out to the Valley or anywhere there's a startup culture, there's a huge fight over programmers, coders, right? And there are all these startups of 5 people or less who have this one kind of miracle coder who's driving the product forward. If that individual leaves, your organization's in trouble, right? So I would summarize this to y'all and say that vaccines are better than cures. So to the extent you can kind of look ahead and say, hey, this could be a problem. It's a reasonable outcome. That could be bad. How do I mitigate it, right? 6, I think one thing that I've come to learn from my startup world experience is, you should manufacture crises. Okay, so what do I mean by that? The easiest way to find out how your organization will do in a crisis is to have one. Okay, so, but you don't want to have a real crisis if you don't have to. So take the time to set out a crisis, kind of what I call a crisis map, okay? There's 2 types of crises, essentially. There are crises that have a high probability of happening, which I see as kind of low impact. And then there are crises that have a low probability of happening but have a high impact, okay? The other 2 portions of the quadrant are irrelevant. If you have a high probability of a crisis happening that's a high impact, almost all organizations naturally solve that, okay? Because that's what you need to do to kind of move the business forward. So write out, what are the crises that can happen, and then have one. The easiest crisis I think to test your organization with is a reduction in cash flow. Okay, and that's especially true for a startup. So if you have a small organization, just test it, right? Just go ahead and say, look, we're going to cut our finances, resources, cash flow for a month and see how we adapt. And to the extent that you kind of manufacture these crises and walk yourself through the training, right? So if you ever talk to people in the military, they'll tell you the purpose of training is to take someone with no experience and beat tactical awareness into them. I think a lot of manufacturing crisis is sort of the same model, right? The 7th component to great culture, I think, is you need to communicate constantly. Most organizations simply do not communicate enough. I would say every organization I've been a part of has failed at this at some level, including BizLab, and that's our fault. That's the exec team's responsibility, and we're trying, frankly, to do a better job. What I would encourage you all to do is don't communicate only what you think people need to know, communicate what people want. So often the questions on the ground are a lot different than what you think you are answering, and so just go ask your team members and say, what do you want to know, right? And then that's the information you should provide. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think great team members want to hear bad news. And I think the reason is if you give people adequate information, they'll help you. Your team members, if the world is bad, they'll help you get out of it, but they need the information. They need to know exactly what's going on. In a vacuum of information, people will assume the worst. And let me tell you, people's imaginations are far, far more creative than the worst scenario you're going through right now. So that's what you're fighting if you do not provide adequate information. Number 8, I think you should have a rainy day fund. It sounds specific, but the truth is, it's hard for people to be a part of a great culture if they're worried about their own economic security. And so if you're in a company, this is less relevant for student organizations, but if you're in a company or a nonprofit, just have a rainy day fund. Okay, 6 months is great, a year is ideal. A lot of people don't want to see cash sitting there, but it gives people peace of mind. And that's something we've had to learn the hard way, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit further. Number 9 is I think you really need to value people's time. Okay, so you should attack what I call time vacuums. The obvious ones are email, meetings, and phone calls. Okay, do you really need that meeting that happens once a week? And do you really need all the people there for that meeting that happens once a week? The answer is probably no. Okay? Ditto for conference calls, ditto for email. If you think about what email is call and response. Okay, so you send out a call and someone responds. You'd be amazed at how many emails you do not need to send and people do not need to receive, and all of that takes away from time. Right? It takes away from their ability to focus on other tasks. So, how do you approach this? What's the action step? I think you need to be ruthless of what I call routine activities. So, what are all the routine activities that you do in your daily life? And then really ask yourself, like, how do I do it better? Do I need it? Can I cut it? The other thing is to do what I call attack traditions. I think many cultures become stagnant or weak because of the desire of leadership to hold on to a particular course of events, right? We've always done this way. But don't be afraid to be the person who says, well, that came out of a different set of circumstances that no longer exists. So the need for this tradition is no longer necessary and it can go. Because change is driven by circumstance, right? Happens in industries, happens to businesses, happens to technology, so why not cultures, right? Why can't cultures change? And the final one, and this is something I've had to learn on the human connection level, and has nothing to do with being a great business or being a great nonprofit, but it's really about being a good person. And I would summarize it like this. I mean, you should be there for people during their greatest triumphs and their darkest hours. Okay, so if you're a leader and you're the guy who is there for someone when they have a family member die, when their wife has miscarriage, when something just goes wrong in their life, I mean, they will follow you to hell and back. That's not the purpose. You don't do it to inspire loyalty. I would encourage you to just do it because it's the right thing to do. And the same for the greatest triumphs. Okay, so when someone is successful in an organization I'm a part of, they get a note, they get a kind of congratulatory gift, and I do it because I want to support them and I want them to soar. And what I find is when you build a culture where the leadership really admires people beyond the sort of, hey, you did the task that we asked you to do, sort of celebrates their life, when great things happen in their hobbies and in their personal life and helps them in their darkest hour, it's such a strong culture. And again, you build one that's respectful, resilient, and resourceful. So I would just say, be there for people when you have nothing to gain and lots to lose, right? So if you have to spend time walking over and talking to them, do it. It's going to make a stronger culture. So that's the totality of what I have through my notes. What questions do you have? Again, we can skip all this. We can answer anything you want. How do we all want to approach it?
So I have a question. A lot of this stuff reminds me of some of the culture organizations I've been in. Another organization I work for struggled with actually changing this type of conversation in the context of what happens when you're trying to change a culture. So how does the building piece change if you're trying to move in and actually take a culture that wasn't working before and change it to one that is more productive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a standard answer for you, right? If you're trying to change the culture of a Fortune 500 company, you're dealing with a larger set of individuals as opposed to a startup where, less than 20, right? Let me give you an example from Habitat. So as I mentioned, I was just meeting with the exec team I got put on the Young Professional Board for Habitat for Humanity International. So there's a group of us who are going to help them work on people in our age group, frankly, right? And so they have this exact problem. Habitat's a huge international organization. A lot of people don't know, I didn't know, $1.8 billion charity, right? And so I'm talking to the exec leadership, and even the exec leadership says trying to move the culture from the top has been an arduous and difficult task. So what's their solution? Their solution is to go focus on what they call the affiliates, the local groups. And they want to show that if we can show a really great example of success at this micro level, it'll permeate up faster than if the top says you should do it. So what I would encourage you to do is go find that small subset in whatever organization and just make the change and see how it works, right? And that can be any change, like working remotely. So you go in the Valley, many of y'all may know, Marissa Meyer canceled his work at home at Yahoo. So there's kind of this war right now of, should you work at home? Does it work? Is it effective for the organization? Go test it, right? So I would encourage you to find the small subset where you can test your idea and just run it. And if it's successful, it'll permeate out to the rest of the organization.
One of the things that you said was around communicating constantly and giving people what they want. How do you manage, like right now, it just seems like there's a lot of information and you're still getting like the emails. I know you're trying to cut that, but how do you manage like delivering what people want and need without sort of overkill or without sort of diluting the message?
Yeah, so think about the goal as opposed to the medium. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Our internet marketing company, Rocket Clicks, I'm just being fully transparent with y'all, was doing something like $2 million in revenue, but no one really had a good handle on financials, to be honest with you. So we had to rebuild it. And one of the things we wanted to give we went through kind of a tough time, a very long story, which I'll have to share with y'all if you're interested. And so our employees were scared. Right? And they were scared because they didn't have the right information. Frankly, we didn't have it, so we had to rebuild the financials. So what do we do? Instead of kind of constantly bombarding them with emails, we found the simple solution was to give them a source of information that we updated that they could come to when they wanted to. And it was a Google Doc. And so we just kept a track of the financials in a Google Doc. So instead of us kind of hammering home the financials to them every day, bombarding them with information, right, to summarize your thought, we said, there's going to be a Google Doc, it's going to be updated, and you can check it at any time. And I think it's one of the best things we did, because now anybody can look at the financials, they have full transparency, and they have a very good understanding of where the business is, but they don't have to get tons of emails and text messages and calls and meetings from us. They can just go to the source. So does that answer your question?
When you're talking about the communication, also the previous issue about making sure that you're testing out ideas, how do you align incentives with the managers? Because sometimes I've been in situations where, it's a matter of someone wants to exert control versus what's best for the organization. How would you balance that?
Yeah, could you give me an example?
Like if you are communicating, but your manager doesn't want that communication going around. So you're talking about communicating to those below you, but you're not able to manage up because that's, they didn't actually want that going around.
Yeah, that's a great question. To put it more crassly, often it's a CYA maneuver, right? And often it's a desire for power and control. I think stage one is people like that are not effective in an organization, right? In any organization, and frankly, I wouldn't want them part of my organization. But sometimes it's reality, so that's where you are, and it's the way of the world. I would encourage you in those situations to draw the top and the quote-unquote bottom, so the people who are working underneath you in the structure and people working above you, in the same room when you make the announcements or pronouncements to deliver your information. And the reason I encourage you to do it all at once is that forces those communities to interact. Okay, so instead of you going to someone and say, do I have the permission to do this? If you have a kind of collective meeting, might not be the most politically correct way to do it, but I find that again, sunlight's the best disinfectant. And most people, once they see how the culture improves when they have access to information, will encourage you to do it.
If you want to make a change in the culture at BizLab or one of the portfolio companies, what do you do to get the rest of the executive team on board? How do you influence your peers to make it happen before you trickle it down?
Yeah, I work with a really great exec team. I'm really fortunate to have a boss who believes deeply in culture and deeply in leadership. And so I'm starting on second base. And so I want to give you that context. But we at the exec team really make the case to one another. Right, so we build a case and we make an argument, And so we have these kind of morning meetings amongst the 8 of us. And so that's where we make the case. When it makes sense, then we'll pass it down. We kind of have the opposite problem, frankly. I think sometimes we accept too many ideas, and we're at war in terms of holding back. We're too nimble, and that's okay. That's a fault of ours that we recognize. So I've had less of that problem that you enunciate, and more of the other issue.
I had a question around your comment about being there for people and kind of caring about them. So I definitely understand the importance of that, but how are you able to balance that with kind of keeping an authority position?
Yeah, I would use the spectrums very carefully. Again, darkest hour and greatest triumphs. You don't want to get too deeply involved in the day-to-day life of people, right? So if you, and you got to make a value judgment. So if something happens and someone's down, is it appropriate for you to come in and comment? I think certainly the passing of relatives or of stuff of that stature, you should be there for people. Do unto others, etc. But other minor inconveniences like your car broke down or stuff like that. I mean, I offer people a ride, but I'm not there kind of day to day like how's your car, right? And it's just I don't have the time, and they don't want me. You got to make a value judgment. Certainly on and be respectful. I need to leave. I need to go to a funeral. Absolutely, right? We'll just find a way to get this project done. And then greatest triumphs, right? I mean, no one will turn down a compliment, and you've got nothing to lose by complimenting someone on doing something well. So I think the spectrum on the success side is a lot larger on how you add value to their lives.
I understand the value of scenario planning and the stress testing. You mentioned before, try to say cut cash flows and see how the company responds to it. But how realistic is that when you're working in a startup, you're trying to build rapidly, and you have the goal of growth in mind? How do you get a team to be on the same, on the same page as you when you say, okay, we're going to try something different for a little while just to see how it works out, when everyone has that growth goal in mind?
Yeah, frankly, I think in a startup it's a lot more realistic. Most startups overestimate their financial runway, in my experience. Okay, so they raise money, they underraise. So what I tell people when I help them raise money is don't raise unless you have to, but when you raise, overraise. Okay, because you're always going to need more money than you think. Most startups don't raise enough, and then they overestimate their financial runway. So I think the need is urgent and relevant to that set of circumstances. So I think what you do is you sit down with your team and say, what are the possibilities here? Running out of money is the easiest one, especially if you don't have any cash coming in the door, right? If you're a user growth organization. So if you know you're going to need cash in the future, and if you say, okay, if we ran out of cash in the next 3 months instead of the 6-month runway projected, how would we operate differently? And what that does is it just kind of gets the gears going, right? If you get people in motion and start like talking to venture capitalists and having that conversation. If any of y'all have talked to VCs or raised money, if you don't have a connection, you call a VC, it could be 2 to 3 months before they see you, right? It depends on where you are in the country. So I would say, this is just about sitting people down and saying, like, for the good of the organization, we need to play this out, right? Certainly, if you go out to places like the Valley, right now, if you're a programmer or a coder, the world is yours, right? You work in all organizations, and if you go to the Valley, you'll find it's a very, what I call hopscotch culture right now. There's programmers who are like, at a startup and they leave 3 months later because it's a better job. You need to plan for that. If you're a startup and you're looking at one guy driving your product forward, it's very realistic to say, well, he could leave. How are we going to move this forward, and what are we going to do? What's the contingency plan? I think frankly, everything's easier to do at a smaller level. The less chefs in the kitchen, the less convincing you have to do. So I haven't found an issue at all. I think it's a lot harder in larger organizations.
Same question, actually.
Okay.
So sometimes the decisions a leader makes go wrong, and usually they have a big impact on the team you're working with. So how does one go about handling the situation, given that they still need to make sure that the team still has faith in the capability of the leader?
Yeah, you just have to communicate the mistake and communicate what went wrong, why it went wrong, and why you need to change. Nobody bats 1,000. I think the mistake most leaders make is they don't explain why things did not go according to plan, right? Sometimes it's you make the right call, but circumstances change. And sometimes it's you make the wrong call, right? Circumstances are exactly what you thought, but the course of events that you chose was the wrong play. In both cases, I think you just need to communicate constantly with people. Again, it's very rare, even when I was in student organizations, for the leadership to provide all the information they have at hand, or as much as possible. And I would encourage you to do that. You'd be surprised at the trust and faith in you that will stay in place, even if the course you set did not work, as long as you explain why. And constantly say, like, this is where we're at, right?
I was hoping you could talk more about the rainy day fund.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, in startups, a lot of them are day to day. How do you go about setting a 6-month or 1 month, 1 year rainy day fund if you just don't have the capital?
Yeah, it's certainly harder in a startup, but that goes back to what I was talking about when you're fundraising. Raise more than you need when you do a raise, right? So I'll give you an example. When you raise from either angel investors or VCs or a company, et cetera, you set up projections, right? But most projections are bogus in a wide variety of ways. Projections is just kind of an educated guess. You certainly can't really do projections beyond 2 years if you're a tech company. And frankly, I think 2 years is a stretch, but that's kind of what people are asking for. So what do? You kind of look at the assumptions, right? The first thing I look at, the equivalent of footnotes in financials are assumptions and projections, okay? So whenever someone sends me projections to kind of review on their behalf, I skip everything and look at how did you build the assumptions, which goes to your question. So I tell everybody who comes to me, and they send me the projections, I say you should put in there a 15 to 25% line item that says buffer for situations we cannot predict, right? Or some variation of that. I think any VC or angel that looks at that will be like, that is totally reasonable that you send me projections for a technology that you may pivot, right? And to say that we just want to have an extra cash pile. Now, if you're starting out of your garage, you're bootstrapping, it is what it is. You're not going to have a rainy day fund, but certainly when you raise money, you should raise the rainy day fund or some portion of it in the raise. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned one of the things that you really try to do best is hire resourceful people. In my experience, that's been the hardest part. I mean, resourceful people are in demand and they want to work wherever, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just curious, like, what is your package or what is your way that you go about thinking about convincing a talented, resourceful person to work for your organization?
Yeah, I would actually phrase the problem a little bit differently. I think it's hard to identify resourceful people. Okay, so I think when you look at a resume, it's often not deep enough to give you a sense of whether that person's resourceful. And so what I'm looking for are clues in how they were resourceful in a particular situation, right? So what was the problem? So I often ask questions as, what was the problem? What was the limitation of resources? And then how did you solve it? Okay, so I'll give you an example from my life. So as Josh mentioned, I worked in prisons in South Africa. So I did first aid training. And I got to work with some of the worst criminals of the South African society. So double murderers, drug smugglers, etc. And so while I was in there, unfortunately, the case was at the time, the only people who had a rougher life than the prisoner, or a slightly better life than the prisoners, were the prison guards. Okay, so they had set up the equivalent of a black market, and the black market worked like this. So people would bring goods and resources to the prison, and the guards would confiscate them. And the only thing that would let the family members, friends bring through the prison was cash. And then when the cash was given to the prisoners, the prison guards would sell to the prisoners a variety of goods and services, often the most common things. So toothbrushes, toothpaste, etc. So they had this black market because they were extremely poor and their families were disadvantaged as well, and this was the only way they could make cash inside. So that was the problem to solve when I got there. It was a lot of prisoners did not have the most basic of goods. Okay, so what were the resources I had in hand? I was a junior at Duke. So not much is the answer to the question. And I didn't know much on the ground, but what I realized was the story of the prisoners, especially in post-apartheid Africa, resonated with a lot of people. So I literally just started picking up the phone, calling people and said, what are the resources that you are no longer using? I called bakeries for bread that they were throwing away. I called health care companies and got their, again, medical supplies, basic toiletries, etc. So those were the resources I aggregated. And then how did I solve the problem? So the issue I had to solve was getting these goods and services past the prison guards, right? So unfortunately, this is being recorded, but I guess I'll have to say that I basically became a smuggler, right? I had to solve that issue. And imagine when you walk into prison, you have a typical airport security system. So there's a metal detector, and you have to pass something through the baggage screener. And so what I did was we had these first aid dummies that we used for our first aid training program, and I slit the throat of the rubber dummy, and I stuffed the dummies with all this stuff. And then that's what I put through the baggage conveyor, and then I kind of walked in with nothing on my person. And what was strange was, and I learned this pretty quickly, it scared me the first time I went there, is we used to go talk to the prisoners, and then the prison guards would leave. Right. So they would kind of leave us with the prisoners, which I thought was insane, and I still think it's insane. But I knew that if I could get the stuff there, and then you learn anything else like organizations, like who are your friends and who are your enemies, right? There are certain prison guards that empathize and frankly had family in the prison, so they wanted to help. So if I could just get past security, so I constantly kind of filled these dummies and put it through baggage security, and that's how I got stuff in. And so that's how I was able to distribute a lot of these like toiletries and stuff that was sold. Now, if it was if it was a good that was perishable, like bread and stuff, then the prison guards were okay with us bringing that in, cakes, etc. But things that they were selling was the stuff I had to kind of throw into the rubber dummy. So to answer your question, I look for stories like that, right? I mean, again, what was the problem you had to solve? What was the resource limitation, and then how did you solve it? It doesn't have to be in the context of my business. It probably isn't. I just want to know if you can find a way in a difficult situation.
Build off of that, because sometimes you have a team that you don't get to select.
Right.
How do you build resourcefulness in your team?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is I don't know. I really don't. I don't know how you train resourcefulness any more than I know how you train intelligence. I don't have a good answer for you. So when you find out, let me know.
Okay, you had a lot of good points. Curious to hear. It's maybe generalizing a bit, but I think there's like maybe a startup culture and then maybe like a corporate culture that hasn't merged or is merging. Kind of just want to get your opinion on where that's headed. From what you said, it sounds like you want to flatten and maybe more personalize a corporate culture, like say Habitat for Humanity, a larger corporation. Then add some structure to some of these startups. Have some conservative measures in place for these stressful situations that often aren't planned for when you're in a growth phase. Do you see like a convergence on a startup group and a corporate group to like this middle ground of a well-run organization, or do you see the two camps staying more separate and maybe just operating a little more like each other but still separate?
Yeah, let me try and attempt to answer your question, and then you tell me if I'm not adequately addressing your particular query. I think there are a series of cultures that are tied to institutions, right? So other cultures I would mention are government cultures. The federal government, if you ever work with them, has a different culture than most state governments and certainly than most local governments. The nonprofit world tends to have its own culture, a way that things are done. I don't have as much experience with large companies, so I may not be the right guy. My knowledge of cultures in large companies just comes from reading a lot of books, candidly. So I don't want to overstate my knowledge in that area. And then there's the startup culture, right? I think what we're seeing with the internet and technology is facilitated by one big change in our world, which is the internet is moving from this service to a utility. Okay? So when you move from electricity being a service to something that permeates everything, it's really changing everything. To go back to culture, here's an example. Companies used to control their brands and the brand messaging. Now customers control brands, right? So the internal company culture is no longer about how do we control this brand and dominate the way it's imprinted upon our customers' minds. It's how do we even corral the gates around this conversation. because we have no choice. We can't control every tweet or Facebook post or something like that, right? So to answer your question, I think these sort of traditional cultures, nonprofit, government, corporate, are coming towards the startup culture not by choice, but driven by kind of the world of circumstance. So if I'm answering your question, which is where's the trend going and where are these cultures going to be, I think it's certainly from these three towards the startup world. Now, if you're in a startup, at some point you have to put in an organizational structure that makes sense for an employee count, frankly. So you're going to have one culture for under 20, another culture for under 100, and then, some people, I don't know if this is true for organization, but 150 is the magic number. You may have heard of Dunbar's number, right? So there's Facebook and there's Path. Path is built upon the idea that you can only have meaningful relationships with 150 people. Somehow, and I can't explain why, startups that I talk to have sort of taken that idea of Dunbar's number and applied it to their organization. And so that's the magic switch in culture. You hit 150 and all of a sudden you have to put all this stuff in place. There's kind of legal things you have to do too at various levels when you hit certain employee counts. But certainly I think as a general trend, because of the internet going from a service to utility, those three monolithic cultures being pulled to the startup world, not by choice, but by chance.
So you've talked a lot about sort of employees and organizations, and I'd like to actually spin it back on you for a bit. Could you share a little bit about how you are sort of continuing to align your personal goals with things that you want to achieve within the world of work, and what your leadership style is there versus what that looks like for you personally, or just how you've thought about managing your career and the different steps that you've taken throughout, but through the lens of sort of personal fulfillment and what it is that you're trying to get out of it?
Yeah, so your question is timing is great. So I just gave a talk at Yale Law School, and the talk was how to use your JD outside of the legal profession. Okay, and more specifically, it was for all these people who were at law school but knew they didn't want to be lawyers. And so how do they figure it out, right? So I really had to sit down and think about what do I wish I had done and what do I struggle to do day to day to answer your question for how to plot my career path and frankly life path, right? So let me do the short summary, and then I have a link if y'all want to hear it. I think there's two fallacies to education in general, whether it's primary, secondary, collegiate, graduate, or kind of life education. And the two fallacies are this. The first is not all knowledge has the same utility. Okay? So I'll give you an example from law school, the world I know best. I was fascinated with constitutional law when I got to law school. It was just something I cared about. It's something I worked on in undergrad, something I worked on in high school. I love the idea of constitutional law. I love this foundational framework upon which all things were built, right? The problem is, in the corporate legal world, very few litigation attorneys actually interact with constitutional law, and no M&A attorneys or financial attorneys or what are called transaction attorneys actually do any constitutional law, right? You can actually count on two hands the number of private attorneys who deal with constitutional law on a full-time basis. And so the utility of knowledge of constitutional law, which, by the way, the vast majority is settled, is actually not very useful in the real world. I mean, that's just, and so I had to go into my classes thinking, man, like I'm probably not going to use this, to be honest with you. So that's fallacy number one, is you should really sit down and think about, like, I'm going to learn all this knowledge, I'm taking all these courses, right? I have a semester, and instead of holding them equally, what's the utility of each of the knowledge sets I'm going to get? The second fallacy of education is that knowledge atrophies, which is just a fancy way of saying you're going to forget most of the stuff you learn. That's okay. Again, it's not anybody's fault, it's not your fault, it's not the educational institution's fault. But if you go into your education knowing you're going to forget most of what you learn, what do you really want to know? Okay, that's how the brain works. And so what I would encourage all of you to do when you approach your job hunt or your educational experience here at Fuqua or your job hunt is to move away from this theory of education is about knowledge acquisition and move towards skills acquisition. Okay, so the long answer to your short question is when I look at my education from now on and my career from now on, what I really do sit down and do is I say, what are the skills that I need to learn? That's my first question, okay? So for me, when I joined BizLab, the skill I really wanted to learn was I needed to learn how to be a leader in a small team, in a place where I could fail and not end up at the front page of the New York Times. That was my qualifier. And so after you do that, then I think you go out there and you kind of construct the ideal job that fits your skills desire, right? User skills that you need to learn. What would that job look like? And then you go and find a job that's closest to your ideal profile. And so I'd always known I was going to leave my corporate law firm pretty soon. The opportunity came up earlier than I expected, frankly. I thought I was going to be there 3 to 4 years, and then BizLab came knocking on my door, and I said, well, this fits the rubric. So does that answer your question? Okay, great.
I think we have time for maybe another question if anyone's got one burning. If not, we can move into the next part. No? Okay, then I guess, I just thought that was a good place to kind of curtail it a little bit and move into our groups to start discussing what we learned today and prepare to give some, the key takeaways. Let me see. But let's first thank Kay for his thoughts, and then let's get back
Got it.
do that thing, and then we'll...
What do you need?
No. You first to kind of give back in terms of, give back to what different ways and most people to talk, and it's a good way for, we hope that it's a good way for you to say, okay, well, that's really not what I wanted them to get out of it, well, that's exactly what I wanted them to get out of it, and, sometimes we'll end up in if you have some comments on what people took away, please share, and then,
Awesome. Sounds good.
Some more coffee, some donuts.
Thank you very much.